Well, thank you. It's great to be with you guys and to talk about something that's really important, becoming more and more important as about every month goes by, and that's related to the issue of conscience in medicine. Now, before we start, I want to acknowledge that conscience sounds a lot like conscious, right? So we can have conscientious, consciously conscience. But I will tell you, let's just handle the first the conscious part. Try saying that 10 times fast. It's actually kind of hard. But conscious, I think it's a good idea for physicians and medical students to be conscious during their practice. Okay, so we'll handle that one up front. The conscience part is a little bit more challenging. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about what is the big deal about your conscience in healthcare. We're going to look at the role and history of conscience through the United States, and how do you know if an issue that you face is one of attacking your moral or religious conscience? And then finally, if you're in that position, what in the world are you supposed to do? Well, the idea of conscience goes back to our founding fathers. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said this. He said, "No provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to man than that which protects the rights of conscience against the enterprises of civil authority." Now, wait a minute. Wasn't this the guy who sort of formed our government? Is he really saying that one of the biggest potential attacks on our conscience is our government? Yep. That's exactly what he said. So did this guy, James Madison, also involved in the founding, as you know. He said, conscience is the most sacred of all property, something to be protected. He also said that the religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. So the importance of conscience was recognized all the way back to the founding of our country. It's something our Constitution is based upon. So what's the big deal about healthcare right of conscience? How many of you have heard that term, the healthcare right of conscience? Yeah, most of you, but not all of you. Well, it's something you're going to hear more and more as you go through your training. And it's simply this. It's the freedom to practice healthcare, medicine, dentistry, in accordance with your deeply held religious, ethical, and moral beliefs. It's simply practicing within those confines of your conscience. Okay, why is it a big deal? Okay, why is it a big deal? I mean, really, isn't this just a personal choice that you make? Well, let me share with you a couple of stories about conscience and how that has been challenged in the lives of some of your colleagues. I'll tell you about Dr. S.P. Now, Dr. S.P. is a family physician, practices in San Antonio. And she was practicing, and the corporation that runs her practice was insisting that she provide contraception to all comers. Dr. S.P. restricts the prescription of contraception to married patients only. She feels like she is morally, religiously obligated not to prescribe to unmarried couples or the like. So after several patients allegedly complained, her medical director informed Dr. S.P. that the hospital administration demanded that all physicians in the clinic prescribe contraception for any and all reasons. So what could she do? Dr. S.P. resigned. She would rather resign than violate her moral conscience. What about Dr. L.R.? Dr. L.R. said this, in 2007, while practicing on the East Coast, the physician's son of a patient on my neuro ICU service asked me whether I was one of those pro-life wackos who was prepared to affirm that food and water were mandatory in his mother. I did affirm my position, and I signed off on the case when the primary and her oncologist acquiesced and euthanized her. I suffered as the medical community turned to exclude me. Conscience issues are being attacked. These are stories told by us, by our CMDA members. There's another doctor, Dr. V.D., who is actually a obstetrician gynecologist, said this, I received a phone call to see if I would perform intrauterine insemination for a lesbian couple in the late 90s. I contacted my malpractice carrier for legal advice and was told that if I refused them, but I did so for a married heterosexual couple, I would likely be sued, and they would not provide coverage. And it also extended to a non-married couple. That's when I decided to no longer perform intrauterine inseminations. So rather than violate her conscience, she said, okay, I'm out. Another Dr. R.S. said, I worked Once in an emergency room in Georgia. I worked there for well over a year, no problems. However, several weeks after refusing to provide a post-intercourse medicinal abortifacient, medication to induce an abortion after conception, to a teenager, I was asked not to come back to that ER. I could never get any explanation from the hospital as to why. To my knowledge, I never had a patient or staff complaint there. In fact, I had a couple of letters of commendation and thanks from patients. Now, it's not just practicing docs that are having these challenges. There's some residents. This resident, Dr. CM, said this: during my family practice residency, I was assigned to participate in an elective abortion procedure. I respectfully declined, citing my belief that life begins at conception. Despite the fact that I was allowed to withdraw from that procedure, I was subsequently subjected to harassment by fellow residents, particularly those in the obstetrics program, throughout the remainder of my rotation with them. One resident in particular brought formal charges against me, citing dereliction of duty. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but that experience will stay with me indefinitely. I would rather resign my position and cease to practice medicine before I would take the life of an unborn child. That's what that resident said. Another resident said, I've been discriminated against during my OBGYN residency. I gave a grand rounds case presentation on abortion complications and was fired for it. It was in San Diego. I gave a talk at grand rounds and I was fired for creating morale problems and insubordination. So these are real stories. Students are not excluded from this. This student, KC, in Gainesville, said this: as a third-year medical student on the family medicine clerkship, I participated in a seminar about cultural competency, diversity, and tolerance. The session was led by one of our assistant deans, who also happened to serve on the admissions committee. Now, during this lecture on tolerance, the dean shared with us that she had interviewed a pro-life applicant for medical school the previous day. During her questioning, the student indicated that she wouldn't feel comfortable performing or providing referrals for abortions. The assistant dean then proclaimed in that lecture with pride that she personally made sure that someone like that won't get into my medical school. Okay? So it is for real for students. One other student said this: I was randomly assigned to an OR one morning to assist in a procedure. No information was given to me by the intern or resident on service. I found myself witnessing an early second trimester abortion on a woman in her late 30s who was obviously distressed. No consideration for my rights of conscience was ever discussed with me before or after this unfortunate circumstance. Medical students are expected to put up or shut up when faced with interventions and therapies they consider morally illicit. So the attacks are out there. The issue of your conscience, abiding by your conscience, is a critical one. One you need to know about, one you need to hear about and be aware about. Martin Luther King Jr. said this: on some positions, cowardice asks the questions, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but because it is right. And that is what this whole idea of conscience in healthcare is about, doing the right thing. Well, I'm happy to tell you that protecting one's conscience dates way back to the foundation of our government, as we mentioned. In fact, all the way back to the First Amendment, which says this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Something that you all know. This is what, in fact, protected conscientious objectors if they refused to go to war. Okay? It wasn't a matter of are they right or are they wrong to object to war. The fact was that for religious, moral, ethical reasons, they felt they were not able to participate. So they had constitutional legal protection to decline participation. That's what our country is founded on. Well, with regard to health care, this really wasn't a big issue. We were going along pretty well. Docs could practice in accordance with their conscience until something happened in the 1970s. You know what that was? Exactly. Exactly. This court case called Roe versus Wade, which of course, as you know, legalized elective abortion in our country. Changed a whole lot of things. Okay. Now, one thing it also changed, and Congress became quickly aware of this, was this issue. Okay. Because when now abortion, by being legalized, had been brought under this umbrella called health care, which is fairly ironic because abortion is neither healthy nor is it caring. But nonetheless, because of this, it was brought under this umbrella of health care. So they realized, okay, now we're going to have a problem. Because now we've said, here is a procedure that is legal that some women are going to desire to have on one hand. And on the other hand, we're going to have physicians and healthcare providers who have, since the founding of our country, had protections to not perform procedures that they find morally objectionable. And what are we going to do? Okay. Well, it was very clear. In fact, shortly after Roe versus Wade was ruled, they made some amendments to the law of the land called the Church Amendments. Okay. And what did they do with this? Well, what they did is they protected the right of conscience for physicians and healthcare providers. What the Church Amendments in the 1970s, right after Roe v. Wade, and by the way, this was passed by, just overwhelmingly passed by Democrats and Republicans, independents. This was not a partisan issue at all. People recognized the importance of the right of conscience. And so what did that do? Well, it prohibited the courts from requiring providers to perform abortions. Okay, you couldn't be required. The court can say, yes, you have to if you were sued and when you refused to. It also prohibited discrimination against it. This is an important word, discrimination. We'll visit it again. So you couldn't be discriminated if you refuse on moral objections to perform or refer for abortion. That means they couldn't discriminate on choosing to employ you, on choosing to promote you, on choosing to terminate you, okay, or choosing whether or not to grant you privileges based on whether or not you'd perform or refer for abortions. Okay. It also, interestingly, extended conscientious protections to lab researchers and lab employees. So if you were being forced, for example, in today's society, if there was research going on that required embryo destruction, and you believe that life begins at conception, and your research was requiring that those embryos would be destroyed as part of the research, because of the Church Amendments, you could say, I'm sorry, I'm unable to participate in this because of my religious, moral views. And you would have protection. You'd have protection, constitutional, and by the law of the land. This is part of the Church Amendments. In fact, this is important as well. It also prohibited any organization who received health and human services funding from requiring anybody to perform, assist in abortion, but not just that. Look what they say. Perform or assist in any part of a health service program or research activity. Any part, if it's against their religious or moral standards. So you see, by definition, when these amendments were made to the law of the land, they were designed to have broad protections, not just that for abortion. So in fact, yes, abortion is clearly what's in front of us now, abortion, sterilizations, this was there. But we realize that there may be things coming down the pike, and it's important that physicians be able to maintain their moral integrity.